Hello. Hi, everybody. I'm Sharon. I'm a visual artist and activist. Warm welcome to all of you. I know we've just had lunch, and I'm really excited to have this conversation here today with my fellow panelists, Karl, Rafiq from ALIM, Art X Law Initiative Malaysia, and Ninin from KOALISI SENI in Indonesia. I kind of have the the privilege of keeping the conversation flowing, but I'll keep my part of the presentation short. So just let me start. I was hoping that this hip hop song would sort of play us in, but I've missed the moment, unfortunately.
So it got to be accepted that what the life is hectic. Cash rules everything around me. Cream, get the money. Dollar, dollar bill, yo. Cash rules everything around me. Cream, get the money. Dollar, dollar bill, yo. Cash rules everything around me. Cream, get the money. Dollar, dollar bill, yo. Cash rules everything around me. Cream, get the money. Dollar, dollar bill, yo.
So that was Wu-Tang Clan's Cream, or Cash Rules Everything Around Me. It's from 1994, one of the best known hip hop songs, if not, some people say it's the best hip hop song of all time. And that's where I got the title for my part of the presentation. Here's Sade in 1984, a full decade earlier. And here's Sam Hui in 1975. Okay, so I'm a visual artist and I think about cash a lot. I'm not going to play music videos about money back through the decades, although that would be fun. But we don't have much time, so let's make the best of it. I'm going to try and set up this conversation so that my comrades Karl and Ninin, who have much more substantial things to share, can take over. So this session is about artist livelihoods, as in money, as in the cream that Wu-Tang was referring to, the most concrete material conditions that determine whether making art is possible. As Sam Hui sang, no money, no talk. But it's also one of the hardest things to talk about. Nobody wants to piss off collectors, funders, grant givers, or any one of our wealthy daddies, or I mean patrons. Actually, patron comes from the Latin pater, and it means father. No one wants to be that difficult person in the crew who insists on contracts and certain payment terms. This is an essay that I wrote for my friend Chong Kim Chew's solo exhibition, Make Money with Money, Make Art with Art. If you want a copy of this essay, which I think made a lot of people angry, you can come and get it from me. I have printed copies here. So you'll start to feel what I call the chill. People start distancing themselves, the calls stop coming, and that's because the reality is, as a creative, it's not just cash that rules everything around us, it's that other C, competition. So how do we get from cash competition to that utopia, collectivity, cooperation? I want to talk about, just quickly, about this artwork, Rich Country, that I think describes the predicament that artists find themselves in. It's an artwork I've been experimenting with since 2020. It came out of the pandemic years. And it's an installation of 300 tiny prints handmade prints of soil microorganisms called Rich Country. There are more than 6 billion of these little critters in 1 teaspoon of living soil. These animals, these microbes are in there fighting, loving, eating, pooping, gossiping, having all manner of exchange. And it's this exchange that is the basis of life on Earth. This is the rich country that is not any individual microbe, but all the relations between them. It's the multitude of combinatorials. So this artwork has to be installed in the company of other artworks, in between, around, or beside. The reactions of fellow artists to having this parasite or invasion of a work next to theirs has been different in different locations. In Georgetown and in Kuching, there was no drama, no tea, everything was fine. People would say, yeah, put your little print that nobody can really see beside my artwork, no problem. At the Ilham Art Show in Kuala Lumpur, it was a different matter. Some artists were welcoming, others didn't care, and some, you'll be surprised to know who they are, no names, were like, absolutely not. There was one fellow artist who said I'd colonized the show and called me the Gestapo, literally, in her Instagram stories. This is a version that I proposed for Sentul Biennale at A+ Works of Art in KL last year. Was realized. This is a proposal for upcoming invitational art competition. It has to go through a screening process. I don't know whether it will go through, but the first prize is 50,000 ringgit. Okay, I want to pull back and just tell you about my background quickly. I grew up in PJ. I came up in the KL art scene of the mid-2000s. In 2011, I moved to Port Dickson, small town, about 2 hours drive from the city. Because even 15 years ago, the city was becoming impossible to be an artist in, just too expensive. In PD, my partner, who's a writer, famously profitable profession, and I take care of his old family home and we don't pay rent. That's how we afford our lives. I live next to mangrove beaches and 2 oil refineries. Since the pandemic, these 2 things have defined my art and activism. These are shadow puppets lit by the flare of Heng Yuan oil refinery that is 200 meters from my home. So being in PD has meant less visibility in the art world, which is definitely its own form of currency. But being outside the center has also allowed me to see some real pathways out from cash/competition towards collectivity cooperation. Living next to an oil refinery is like being neighbors with Mordor. Over the years, I've organized with my neighborhood to keep the refinery's emissions under control. We started with not knowing our neighbors, with neighbors doing this. Has that happened to you? When you go up to somebody's house and they close their curtains because they think that you're going to sell them something. But now we have over 40 people in the Taman WhatsApp group. And I've observed that the path to collectivity involves the following. The first is shared concerns, and there's nothing more immediate than an oil refinery on your doorstep. The second is shared geographic location. This is Heng Yuan Refining Company, and next to it is Petron Refinery. That pin there is where my house is, and that's around there is my neighborhood. Now, this is more complicated, I think, in the art context because there are artists all over the country. And it is very difficult to organize based on shared geographic location. But I found that this is absolutely a crucial question, so it bears thinking about. The third is concrete achievable goals. And for me, concrete achievable goals are law-based. So it is wise to pick one single law that you can focus on and bring your ask to the authorities, because that is the leverage that you have. The more abstract you are, the less effective your organizing is. So for us, the crucial part of our activism was based on this one law that states that all industry must keep their black smoke emissions to below Ringelmann scale 2. That's that Ringelmann scale on the right-hand side there. And the last one is strategic visibility. So in 2024, the then Minister of Environment, Nik Nazmi Nik Ahmad, paid a visit to Hongyuan refinery. After that, we finally got our face-to-face meeting with the refinery CEOs. As a result, the black smoke has been kept to Ringelmann scale 2 and below. So we achieved that. But behind this most visible moment is spreadsheets, letters, signatures, meetings, conflicts, really boring stuff. By the time the politician steps in to play his or her role, there's all this momentum that has already been created, mostly out of sight. And I think this is a very crucial question in terms of organizing that we do in the arts, because it's such a public-facing industry. Okay, so how do we get from cash competition to collectivity cooperation? I want to propose another C, and that is conspiracy. This word also has Latin origins. Con means together, and spirare, to breathe together. So let us conspire, my comrades, and I'm going to call on Ninin first to share about organizing with KOALISI SENI. Yeah, thank you, Ninin. Please take it away.
Okay. I actually don't want to show all of these slides, but before we go into that organizing, let me tell you this recent realization that we found, because KOALISI SENI have been monitoring artistic freedom since 2020, but the database dated back to 2010. We have documented around 400 cases so far, more or less, but each and every single case of violations has an economic dimension to it. So we figured out that this economic concerns might be something that is very urgent, but often overlooked, and also probably be a prerequisite for the fulfilling of any other rights within the artistic freedom context. In fact, for example, we share your concerns in Indonesia too, how we are very precarious and vulnerable in terms of economy. And whenever that condition exists, we might probably be more normalizing to censorship, for example, and to other kind of rights violations. In Indonesia, the government have a very little understanding on the scope of arts as a labor, as a work. Let me show you this recent case that we had. So this guy is Amsal. He is a videographer, previously employed project-based by a local government. He was put on trial because he was accused of marking up some of the fees of his work. One of the evidence shows that he includes fees such as ideation and editing. And the government said, no, you cannot include that. That should be zero. You are marking up the fees. So this shows how very little the government understands the scope of art. They are very output-based. So the long process of art is not included in the government procurement system yet. That's why he was accused of marking up the funds. Although he was released later, but this really shows something. We are very often overlooked. And within this precarity, it really disproportionately affects women and the queer community, actually. We had separate researches on that shows that a lot of women and queer workers are not unionized, for sure. They're not part of any similar collectives. A lot of them, almost 50% of them, doesn't work under written agreement. And many of the trans women also don't have permanent positions within their workplace. There is this one case that I want to tell you. We found it on 2025. There was this female DJ. So she was performing in a club, and then she got harassed by one of the her audience, sexually harassed. She wanted to warn him, and by turning off the music suddenly. But at the end of the day, she was fired by the employer, by the club, because she was accused of damaging the electronic equipment. So she didn't get any justice for this incident, and she even got fired. This also shows that the cutting off the economic rights to an artist will automatically, of course, silence her. So it will censor her. It will stop her from any kind of activity that is, resisting and wanted to, advocate for her rights. So that is the second question. And we think that shared shared vulnerabilities will bring out solidarity, and then from solidarity will bring out some kind of a resilience. But what I want to offer here also, that we look the other way around. If we see a resilient community, we have to unpack a lot of those. How and where does this resilience come from? It is probably something that really shows how much injustice that they have suffered so far. So in one of our research, there's this, we found this one theater group in East Java. So this particular group named Ludruk Tobong. This main actor is a trans woman. So this theater group is played by all trans women. They play their show every night from a semi improvised script that is written by their leader every day based on the availability of the actors. The space also houses the some of the trans women who are mostly elderly that doesn't have any place to stay. And then the leader is sort of have responsibilities of their basic needs. If somebody got sick, they take care of them. And during the day, the leader dressed as men and sell fruits at the market, the nearby market. So that was it your second thing, that you have to have like a shared geographic to live, yeah. But this also shows, this group sustain because they also have like these tactics and strategies to get close to the local police. So just as here, I think trans women, queer is very much sort of banned. They morally banned, yeah. But they exist and they try to like participate in competition by the local police. So they have this competition to get close with their public. So it's been a culture since the New Order era. So military and police will usually get close to the public by having like arts thing organized. So they participate in that. They receive like commission work, but with like making a theater script from like anti-drug campaigns, for example. So they try to do that, but we can imagine how much work that you have to put to sustain this kind of community. And then how artistic labor is not only like an 8-hour work, right? It is like a 24-hour consistent labor, integrating care work and advocacy. So it's a lot of work to do. So yeah, I think it's just to illustrate like how much vulnerability that they have. And the question is, yeah, how long will this kind of community sustain? So this is where they live and so far. And then they also try to make money from smaller donors, I guess, some of them, but not everyone. So yeah, just a illustration of what it looks like in Indonesia. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ninin. It's really great to see a different context from us, and because it also informs our local context. What it sounds like is that a lot of this is informal work, but then the informality of that work interfaces with the state and the law, and which directly goes back to impacting on artists' livelihoods. So we've been talking amongst the three of us about the Gig Workers Act in Malaysia, and how this law, it's quite a new law in Malaysia, and Karl will share about it. This act, sorry, is an attempt to formalize this informal or precarious work that Ninin has been describing. I have a question about the videographer case, but maybe we can leave that till later. Okay, Karl, please go ahead.
Thanks, Ninin and Sharon. I think there are many questions that I'll address, and I think thoughts from both your presentations. But yeah, we'll move on. So we go into the Gig Workers Act 2025, or otherwise known as Act 2025, Act 872 for creatives. It applies to mainly, and it was led by the Grab drivers, the Food Panda drivers, your e-hailing drivers, and your p-hailing drivers. The creatives were put in later on, but mainly from organizations which have some sort of organized capability. So mainly like film workers and theaters. So we'll see who's covered and who's not. Yeah. Firstly, this act is meant to protect the rights of gig workers in Malaysia. And the gig worker here is defined as a citizen or permanent resident of Malaysia who enters into a service agreement with a contracting entity. That's what you call people who commission you for the performance of the services and receives earnings. In this act, very importantly, because there's been a lot of confusion around reading this act, it's just fully enforced in the past week. Yeah. So there's a lot of things that are still being ironed out, but it's essentially there already. Gig workers under this act is divided into platform-based and non-platform-based. Platform-based are those who goes through the platform providers. So your Grab, your GoGet, and all these jobs where freelancers would come in and be hired through this intermediary platform. Whereas a lot of freelancers who don't go through platforms will be classified under non-platforms. This is important because they both have different sets of rights and systems under this law. Okay, and just to say here as well, grounding this act, many other gig workers act around the world focus mainly on platform providers, e-hailing drivers and p-hailing. But Malaysia is quite unique, not the first, but rather unique relatively in that it includes a lot of creative workers. Yeah, so we'll have a look at that. Who are the creatives who are currently covered? Actors, film crew, videographers, photographers, musicians, singers, composers, lyricists, makeup artists, stylists, hairdressers, freelance journalists, this could be your writers, interpreters and translators. These are the only creatives currently covered under the Act. Why? Politically speaking, because they had the numbers and they had a seat at the table in the stakeholder engagements. Many other creative sectors, your graphic designers, visual artists, dancers, what else? I'm blanking out. What is it? Fashion folks. Who else here who feels aggrieved by this? Theater is under actors lah. But okay lah, no lah. But you have, yes. So there are a lot of other creative sectors. Understand? Graphic designers and all are not covered under this simply because they did not collectively organize and come into the stakeholder engagement phase. But this is an opportunity. Yeah. The rights of gig workers, just generally because we don't have time, I'll point 8 key rights here. First, you must be informed the rate and details of earnings, period of work, party obligations, services, and method of payment before the worker agrees to perform the service. This is so important because a lot of people only understand what they're doing while they're doing it, how much they're paying and everything. Yeah, you must receive earnings within the agreed period if it is not mentioned in the agreement. Now, this agreement can be written or verbally, whether through WhatsApp or email, or not, they all count as agreements. Payment must be made within 7 days from the date of completion of service. That's quite a change in this industry, and not many people are talking about this. Yeah,
It's law now.
it's law, and it's an offense, up imprisonment and fines if this is not complied with. But it is not only always 7 days. Yeah, it's only if you don't mention it in your agreement. If you mention 30 days, for example, then it's 30 days. But if you don't mention anything, the law defaults at a minimum standard of 7 days. Who here has mostly been paid within 7 days of a completion of a job? Rarely, right? This changes, even if you don't apply under this act, if you're not covered, this pushes market standards, right, of what's expected in freelance economies in Malaysia. Third, you must be consulted and informed if there are any changes to agreement. Yeah. Fourth, you cannot be prevented to enter into any agreement with other parties. This mainly applies to platform providers, because there's been some attempts to say that you can only work with Grab, you cannot change from Foodpanda and whatnot. But freelancers as well, now you know that they cannot block you from saying that, oh, you cannot, this kind of anti-competition clause. You cannot be with another fashion house. You cannot be with another production house during this period. No, that's not allowed under this law. Fifth, you cannot be discriminated against in relation to conditions of work, assignment of service, or payments of earnings. This does not mean direct, every kind of discrimination is not allowed. It's mostly as to unreasonable discrimination. So for example, if there's no reason for a woman to do not to do a graphic design work, they rejected you and you find out on the basis of gender, then that can be a cause of complaint. Fifth, you cannot be terminated without just cause or excuse. 6, you must be given a safe and healthy environment to work in by the contracting entity, whoever that commissions you. This is important. They have to do basic baseline risk assessments. They have to provide you safety equipment where necessary. So for example, if you're an actor going to, a very sort of risky environment, all the safety procedures must be in place. Otherwise, it's an offense by the contractor. Yeah, but this only applies to non-individual contracting entities. So if the person who commissions you is an individual, it doesn't apply. So this is for companies, platform providers, and things like that. This is basically because it might put too much burden on individual commissioners. Lastly, you cannot be given less favorable terms than what the Act provides. So any of these, if the contract somehow states something that's less progressive, so for example, you can be terminated because we don't like your face at any time. Cannot. Because now you have you cannot be terminated without just cause of excuse. Yeah. So that contract, even though you signed it, now with this law, and even if you signed it before this law came into place, it has now been overwritten by this law. This is very important as well. Now, the main problem a lot of people face in the freelancing community amongst creatives is non-payment of wages, fees, or late payments, and people just don't know what to do. Now you have, for individuals, an e-aduan gig under the Ministry of Human Resources website. Simply register and put in your complaints there, and they'll advise you as to how to enforce your payments from those who commission you, the contracting entities. If you are a company or platform provider or not, you have to have an internal grievance mechanism to resolve disputes. And if that fails, then you can go to a free conciliation by the Industrial Relations Department. And if your commissioner is someone who is an individual, you can go straight to the conciliation. If someone pays you late or doesn't pay you, can go straight to conciliation by Industrial Relations Department. And if that's not resolved, then you go to almost a court-like atmosphere under the Gig Workers Tribunal. For industry-level issues, they also provide a platform for gig workers, contracting entities, unions, stakeholders, and government to discuss policies, including minimum wage rates, including standards, whether it's safety standards, health standards, working hours standards for freelancers will be done under the Gig Consultative Council. They will advise the government on all that I said. And it's very important for creatives essentially to get together, collectivize, conspire, and get on these tables where they're discussing your future, your standards of work. Yeah, because art is, yes, it's about beauty, it's about storytelling, it's about provocation, criticism, meaning, but it's also work, it's labor. You give value, you deserve rights. Okay. And these are some very popular misconceptions that's thrown out in the media, and I feel like we need to correct it. One, a service agreement here can be both in verbal or written form. Yeah, even if you just say and it's agreed upon and there's a witness, you can enforce it. It's a valid contract. Yeah, you can have it through WhatsApp, you can have it through emails, but the best is of course a clear written agreement. But in any case, this just helps in proving in court or in the tribunals. It helps you more when it's clearer, yeah, in written form. No unionization rights are actually provided. This is unfortunate because the International Labour Organization, the UN, have been calling for gig workers to have the rights to unionize. The employers have mostly fought against the rights of freelance workers in Malaysia to unionize. This should be changed and advocacy must be focused on this. However, you are now allowed to join associations as gig workers. So you can talk about it, have industry dialogue, etc. But what you cannot do is have collective bargaining agreements. Why is this important? Collective bargaining agreements, instead of going to the government, going through the process, having a tripartite with the companies, with the contracting entities, and all the different ones to discuss for months on end, collective bargaining agreements are efficient and they're adaptable and they are quick. Yeah, you have a collective bargaining agreement, a new AI issue comes up and they change every week, right? A new issue comes up. If you have a collective bargaining agreement, you bring it up to the collection association of employers or contracting entities, and then you say, we need an AI clause on this. And then they sign and you sign, and everyone's protected as to that, right? Not fussy. So unionization is actually very important, but we have very low unionization rates in Malaysia. Next, there's a lot of talk that you need to pay SOCSO now for freelance workers. This is not true. Only platform providers have to register these e-hailing and p-hailing riders for SOCSO and deduct workers' contribution. So what does this mean? The corporations don't even have to pay a cent for your SOCSO. They just make sure it's mandatory for you. Why? Because they fought against not paying. There is no requirement for SOCSO contribution by the platform providers. The other thing is that the Act does not apply to non-Malaysians other than permanent residents and lacks enforcement for foreign platforms or contracting entities. This is very important because a lot of our freelancers also get jobs from international websites, right? Your, I don't know, the Etsy's or whatever. These, you know, they can come under the law because you're doing the work here, but to enforce those rights in Canada or Europe is a very difficult thing, and we currently don't have a simple solution to that. And finally, all these things that I'm talking about is not just for fun. They're not voluntary standards. They're offenses if they're not complied with. Fines up to 50,000 or 100,000 ringgit for some of them, and imprisonment for up to 2 years or both for not complying. Yeah, that's my presentation. That's our details. But ultimately, organization, I think, is a critical and opportune time for sectors, especially those that are not covered under the Act, for creatives, to get together in numbers, collectivize, organize, and then let's enter the consultative council. So it's demand. Power concedes nothing without demand, right? They won't just give it to you for free. We must say what we want. We have the numbers, and it's important for that. Yeah, thanks, Sharon.
Thank you, Karl. Wow. Okay, I have so many questions, and I'm sure all of you do too, especially about this Gig Workers Act. But before that, I would just like to pass it back to Ninin and ask about the current state of play in regards to policy and also on the ground organizing? Because I think these are the two questions that are coming up in this session. You know, in Malaysia, the law exists now, but maybe the ground organizing is not quite there. But how is it in Indonesia?
I think it's the other way around. But I have to mention that we have several laws that regulate specifically on the artistic and cultural sectors. So we have law on creative economy, we have law on cultural advancement, and we have another law on copyright. However, the two of the first I mentioned, there is no specific laws that recognize artist as worker, not even the social economic protection on it. And then the law on copyright, while it states that artists should get royalties, of course, it's really much privilege at the interest of the corporations, the middlemen, the recording companies, the platform, the streaming platform, and then the production houses, for example. However, a lot of groups are trying to circumvent, of course, these gaps in policy. For example, some production houses in Indonesia, like the smaller ones, they try to make their own rules. For example, they try to apply a separation of ownership. For example, if you're a scriptwriter, then your rights is separated for the rights of the directors, for example. So if the film gets synchronized, or if the film gets adapted to another thing, then the scriptwriters also get a separate royalties. They also applies things like bonuses. So not only the directors and the scriptwriter that can get royalties, but after they are past, after they get past a certain profit, actors also can get like a percentage of the royalties. But this is very much of an initiative. And the ones who apply this are the smaller production companies which were founded by also an actor or an art workers. So they act in a solidarity because they understand how difficult it is to get a remuneration, for example. So yeah, we have but like I mentioned, we have also very low rate of unionizing, but we have a creative union in Indonesia, but only one. They've been trying to advocate a lot of things, but well, it's still a little. A lot of the organizations have like an association function more than a union. KOALISI itself is a member-based organization, but we do research and advocacy around the artist rights. So yeah.
Thanks, Ninin. We have 10 more minutes? 2 more, oh no. Okay, let's quickly open it up to the floor. Okay, I already see one person with a question. Anyone else? Let's take a couple.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Ashwin from Kuching, Sarawak. It's a two-part question, very quickly. First things first is like you were mentioning about, this is to Karl, by the way. You were mentioning about platform providers. So besides e-hailing and p-hailing platform providers, let's say if we are running like a platform where we're helping freelancers to basically get gig jobs and stuff like that. Do we fall under that category or do we not? And if we do, how are our rights going to be different than non-platform providers? And my second part is that a lot of these people that we are getting on a lot of these freelancers that we're getting on our platform, we're basically training them to also look along the lines of becoming artpreneurs, in a sense of like setting up like an LLP or setting up like a Sendirian Berhad so that they can like better, manage their liabilities, to better manage like their scaling of the companies and stuff like that. Does this stop them from getting the gig workers, status? Because if you ask me personally, I think they're still gig workers in the sense of like how you're operating, but from an SSM standpoint or from a legal standpoint, I'd like to hear your thoughts about it. Yeah, thanks.
And can we get the one more question?
Hi, I'm Dime. I'm an editor and artist. My question is for Sharon. Could you speak a bit more about, you said something really interesting in the beginning, visibility in the art world. It's a form of its own currency, and specifically moving away from KL to PD. I would like to hear a bit more how you navigate that, especially because I have seen you from ANX days, from the ANX days, and to me, I feel you are very visible.
Interesting. Okay, thank you so much. Karl, go ahead with Ashwin's questions. So the first one was, Ashwin, you are functioning as platform provider, and what status does that give you under the
I'll give a quick one because I think some complicated details legally there. But essentially, if you were to provide a platform, just general freelancers, if any of those creatives or any of those other freelancers, I didn't list them all out, I only listed for the creatives, come under your platform for those specific kinds of work that are listed down, then you will have to register them under SOCSO. You will have to take care of their health and safety provisions. There are longer lists of things for you to do. You have to deduct their SOCSO and a few other things. But those are the key things that you have to think about. And the other thing is if they are entrepreneurs, right? If they become entrepreneurs and they have companies and things like that, right? If they are in companies,
like if they have an enterprise or a Sendirian Berhad?
yeah, but ultimately they can have a Sendirian Berhad or enterprise or whatever not, but as long as their work is in the freelance economy, right? They operate with contracts that are not full-time employment. That means you don't get your EPF. That's one of the clear things, right? From full-time employment. That is most likely a gig workers act, law and practice, and it comes under this law. Of course, courts will have to determine this day to day on a case-by-case basis, but ultimately you have to go back to the definition that it is a person who enters into a service agreement with a contract entity for the performance of services and receives earnings for the service. So if that person is a sole proprietor, for example, that's pretty much considered an individual, even though registered under SSM. But yeah, you have to look at it case by case. Thanks.
Okay, and I'll just answer the question quickly about visibility. I think this one gets into some psychology of visibility, but it's also very real because it's a form of money. I would just say, like in terms of data, for example, do you know that Instagram, the engagement rate on Instagram is the lowest amongst all the social platforms? But which one, as artists, do we spend the most time on? Instagram is even lower than Pinterest. But does that mean any of us are getting off Instagram? No. So I would use that as my answer about the feeling of being visible versus the requests or contracts that are coming into my inbox. Sometimes those two things don't match up, but in the mind and in terms of circulation of one's name and ability to get work, these things are connected and not that's not really on the policy level, I think. Yeah, so thank you for your question. Thank you all so much for your attention.